Hello everybody, and we're back here with the fabulous Joe Welding. And in our last video about the Century series, we made some comments about a couple of the aircraft.
I love the lineage and the history of these fighters. I will start by saying they were very unsuccessful in general.
Now, there's two things we need to clear up. When we said they were not successful, well, Joe, why did we say they were not successful?
Yeah, what I meant to say by that comment was they weren't very successful as their primary design mission, meaning frontline fighters. Most of the Century series really were only competitive in that role for at most maybe a few years, 3-4 years at most, some of them less than that. That said, these airplanes did fly for quite a while for the most part. Almost any fighter eventually, if it becomes a non-competitive fighter, you hang bombs on it as a great fighter bomber, which you know that has been true ever since airplanes have been flying. Right?
Oh yeah.
So yes, a lot of these airplanes did fly for decades, in some cases probably 3 decades, but not in the role they were originally intended for. So that was really what we meant by that, was technology was changing so fast. You design for one thing and it quickly is obsolete in that one thing, but it's an expensive asset, you figure out other ways to use it.
Oh, 100%. So we are here in Denver at the Wings Over the Rockies Museum, and we're going to be doing some filming, including the thing that's over there, and we're really excited about that film. That's another video coming up. But we thought, as they have a collection of Century Series aircraft here, we better cover the one that we were a bit mean to. So what are we going to talk about today, Joe?
You mean the B-18?
Yes, there's, check this out, there's a B-18 back here. If I can get this camera to work. We're not going to do it. No.
Right back here, we've got the one that we said was uninteresting.
Yes, it's hiding behind the B-18.
Which of course is the F-101.
Yeah.
And once again, what I meant by it was uninteresting. Real quick, we should note, so we went F-100, F-102, where's the F-101? There actually is one here somewhere. We'll skip over that because to me, actually it's right here behind us. To me, it's less interesting. Its wing design, it's less interesting for this story that we're talking about. So last time we were mostly talking about aerodynamic advances in these aircraft, so inlets and wings specifically. I stand by that statement. Compared to the others, the F-101 is somewhat uninteresting. By itself is interesting, but we had already talked about the F-86 and the F-100. There's really nothing new on the F-101 that those aircraft didn't already have as far as wings and inlets. There is a lot more about that airplane that is interesting when you talk about the mission and what it was used for eventually. So yeah, we could go dig into that. Yeah,
so everyone who's commented that we were really mean about it, this is for you. So without further ado, the McDonnell, I guess it is just the McDonnell, isn't it? Because it's that old, the McDonnell F-101 Voodoo. So Joe, here we have it. It's, we were making jokes, dear listener and viewer, because we had a lot of stuff to cover that day, and one had to go, and it was this one. But for all of you who are voodoo lovers, and I mean that in the case of the aircraft, another podcast for the magic. Joe, let's get into this. Let's talk about the F-101.
Yeah, so let's quickly talk about the inlets and the wing, even though we said they were uninteresting. So the inlet...
Stop saying that, we're going to get in trouble
exactly.
again.
The inlet's pretty traditional pitot-style inlet, like we talked about before, somewhat on the sharper side. So this aircraft does go Mach 1.5, which is pretty good for this era. You know, this airplane first flew, I think, in '54, so pretty sporty for the time it actually flew. Wing is a pretty traditional delta, or not delta, but a swept wing. It's a pretty small wing. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the geometry and the tech of the wing, again, is pretty traditional for the time period. A little bit of conical camber, we talked about that last time, that leading edge droop. Not a lot, but a little bit. Wing fence, again, all these details we kind of talked about in that previous episode. Yeah. Go back and watch that one if you want to learn more about all of that.
See, he's a YouTuber already. He's always getting he just needs to point up to the corner so that, you know, the box, there we go.
So what is interesting about this airplane? Probably its most unique feature is that it is the only Century Series jet that is a twin, so a twin engine aircraft. So 2 jets in the back instead of just a single one. And that really allowed this airplane to do things that the other Century Series could not. Primarily fly much further range and carry more payload. So this airplane was originally intended, so it's the kind of the prototype of this airplane, I say kind of because it evolved over time, is a airplane that they only built two of called the XF-88, they meaning McDonnell Douglas. And it looks very similar to this, and it was actually developed in the late 40s as a bomber interceptor. So the Air Force and the manufacturers at the time very much had World War II in their mind of, hey, we got these big bombers, they're not going away. We've got fighters that want to shoot them down. We need planes that can escort them and fend off the fighters. That very quickly became not a thing because of mostly surface-to-air missiles. But that was the original version or goal of this airplane, so it needed long range. And really the only way to get there in a Century series is to make the airplane heavier and carry more fuel. They already had the biggest engines that were available at the time, so the only way to do that is to put two engines on it. Basically make the airplane not a whole lot bigger, but just put two engines so it can carry more fuel. And so that was kind of the design point of this airplane.
Because just to say, we've got the Super Sabre, the F-100 over here.
Yep.
So it's basically just a scaled up single, isn't it?
Yeah.
A lot of the sort of lines on it are quite similar between the North American aircraft and this one from the spec.
Yeah,
so
yeah, exactly.
We're just taking that up a notch when it comes to scale, range, all those things.
Yes. This is a B model, so it has two seats. The original A only had a single seat, and it looked even more kind of like a slightly larger F-100. Again, the bomber mission very quickly went away. And unfortunately, because this thing was mostly built for long range, it's got a very small wing, kind of like an F-104 in a way. The wing loading is similar, which makes it a terrible maneuverable airplane. It's terrible for what we would call dogfighting. Originally it had guns. The B model, they took away the guns. But with that small wing, it's not a very good fighter. But what they figured out is with the weapons carrying capability and the range, it actually made a great fighter bomber. So that was the F-101B with a second seat for a weapons systems officer and the ability to go 3,000 miles, which I think is somewhat like twice what all the other Century series will fly. The other mission of this airplane that also worked in well with that capability was reconnaissance, or recce. So there was a different version, the RF-101, which had a different nose, didn't have radar, instead it had a bunch of cameras in the nose. But again, that high speed and long range, it was a really good airplane for that purpose. Again, very different what it was designed to do, but the ability to have two engines, more fuel, more range, gave it a lot of capability.
So the team here very kindly let us get under the ropes.
Yeah.
So shall we jump under and start poking around the wing, the intakes, and?
Yeah, one other thing, if we can slide around, I'll talk about here real quick. The other claim to fame of this airplane, I don't know about this statement from a worldwide standpoint, but in the US Air Force, this was the first fighter that was intentionally designed from the beginning with radar. Other aircraft like the F-86 and the F-100, they were able to add radar to later, but it was sort of an afterthought. This airplane was designed from the very beginning with radar. The other kind of interesting point of this airplane, we talked about the F-102 last time, and the original F-102 that couldn't even go supersonic initially, and they had built this airplane around this massively modern fire control system with a radar and the avionics to be able to track individual aircraft and assign missiles to them and so forth. When that airplane couldn't fulfill its mission, all of a sudden now the Air Force had this capability it wanted that was not able to be flown. So they actually, in the B model, I believe, they took that fire control system with that radar from the 102 and put it into this airplane. So the Air Force did have that capability. So that was the whole point of the F-101B. They took away the guns, they put internal missile racks inside, and you basically had a very capable, again, not really a dogfighting airplane, but an airplane that had a very sophisticated, for the time, radar and fire control system and the missiles to back it up. So for a short period, it was pretty effective in that it had technology that really existed nowhere else. But again, a couple years later, everything else catches up.
Yeah. So, interesting.
Very interesting.
It is very interesting.
Yeah.
There we go. So
Yeah.
we're making, so all the dear commenters, here we go. Let's get into this, because this is a very, very lovely example they have here. And like we said, the team here at the Wings Over the Rockies Museum, which is a lot of fun. We're going to do a few videos here. And I know you can't see me, and I'm just showing Joe, but we're going to get into this. So shall we get around the other side?
Let's go look at the
there's a little
tail.
bit more there. So let's duck under the bolo, and there's the F-102 that we were just talking about.
And you can see the white nuclear bombs here, tactical nukes. So that was a big role for this aircraft. Of course, never used them in anger, but those would fit inside the missile bay of this aircraft. So its kind of middle life as a fighter bomber was quite useful in that role.
Yep.
Again, mostly because of the range.
Yeah, okay, so let's do this without falling over. There we go. So you're getting a slight behind the scenes tour here of what goes on at Wings. This is a bit lots of people don't get to see at museums, is the boxes of stuff that are all around the place. But here we are.
So go ahead.
No, I say, right, so we've come around the back because there's, when we get onto the wings and stuff in a second, we need to talk about this, because the tail, we've mentioned the dual engines, we're going to come back to that in a minute, but the tail is quite unique when it comes to Century series on this, isn't it?
Yeah, so we should have talked about this, I'll admit, because this is probably the most unique part of this aircraft relative to the other Century series jets, and they all have their own little thing that they were trying. So we were talking a minute ago about the original sort of prototype for this airplane, the XF-88. Its horizontal tail was down a little bit below where you see the tail number, the 80271. Think of just a little bit below that is where the tail was at. That aircraft was just a prototype. There was two of them. It had a big problem in that at low speed, when the aircraft would get slow and the wings would start to, the airflow of the wings would start to separate, it would start to stall. It had this problem that a lot of swept wing aircraft have called pitch up, where the outer tips, the lift starts to fail, and at the tips being swept aft, there's a lot of lift toward the back of the airplane. When that goes away, the airplane's no longer balanced, and so the nose starts to rise. As that happens, the wing vortex actually moves inboard and lands right on that tail, which then pushes down on the tail and exacerbates the problem. And then when that starts to happen, that pitch up, I don't want to call it a maneuvers per se because it's not intentional, it becomes very unstable and the airplane essentially loses control. That was discovered on that aircraft. One way to solve that is to do what's done on like the F-100, which is you put the tail very low. This is a better location for that because you're getting a lot of downwash off of the wing, and when the wing lift starts to go down, that downwash starts to go away as well, somewhat, and the airplane stays balanced. So North American figured out that this is like the best place to put the tail on an airplane, and a lot of fighters after this era, this is exactly where it's at. It's not the only place, but it's a place that works very well. On the F-101, of course, if you try to put the tail there, you're right in the afterburner exhaust of the engines, which just clearly doesn't work. The place they had it was, it could have went slightly lower, but not low enough. So on this aircraft, they did a lot of wind tunnel testing, and they decided to go up to the top of the vertical to help keep that vortex that comes off the wing from hitting the tail and help alleviate the pitch up problem. It didn't 100% solve it, but it helped a lot. What they did find is there's a secondary phenomenon that can happen called deep stall, and there's a lot of swept wing airplanes, including early airliners, that had this problem. If the airplane gets into a high nose-up pitch attitude and the wing starts to stall and it gets into a fully developed stall, what can happen is the separation off the wing can actually blanket the horizontal tail in a way that you don't have any pitch control anymore, and the aircraft can get into this semi-stable but essentially unflyable condition where it's basically sinking out of the air. It's not really flying, you can't land it, you're going to pancake into the ground, but because your tail is blanketed, you can't, the pilot can't control his way out of that. And this airplane had somewhat of an issue with that. And I think this airplane eventually, the one way to solve that is you put a stick pusher in, which is a feedback control system that the airplane knows, hey, you're getting close to stall, it pushes the stick forward, says, I'm not going to let you do that. And so that's a way to solve that. And most airliners of the era ended up having those as well.
Because the Javelin famously suffered from that in a big way as well, with the big delta.
Yeah. So T-tails, there's pluses and minuses to them. If you get them in the wrong spot, that's the big minus. And the spot is set by airplane geometry. The length of your tail, the height of the vertical, is hard to change that once you learn you have a problem. You kind of got to redesign the airplane to solve it. So not the airplane's best feature, but it's an interesting thing to talk about that's totally dictated by the layout of the airplane.
Okay, so we've covered the tail, interesting things, and we'll have to cover the Gloucester Javelin at some point because it's a very interesting aircraft. And my lecturer at college was an ex-Javelin pilot, so he would talk about the thing pancaking in.
Yeah.
And allegedly, there's a story of a US Air Force pilot who was insisting he could loop it and didn't. So there's that to go. But what was the next element you wanted to talk about?
Someone might ask, well, if this tail layout has issues, why even do this in the first place? And the reason is again, this was the period of real experimentation in jets. What even configuration is the best configuration? Most of the other jets we've talked about, like the F-100, the jet flow path is the entire length of the fuselage. The inlet is at the very nose, the exit is at the very back, there's an engine in there somewhere, and there's long ducting, either ahead of and or behind the engine. That takes up a lot of space, it's heavy, there's a lot of losses in there because all of the airflow has to move past all those surfaces, it creates drag, which reduces the amount of thrust that you get. So this configuration was one that McDonnell Aircraft got onto early as theoretically a more optimum way to build an airplane, in that your flow path through your engines is about as short as possible. And so you don't have an inlet on the nose, you've got it back, right at the root of the wing. You've got an engine right there, which is right at the center of gravity of the airplane, give or take, which is great from a balance and a weight standpoint. And then you basically put your afterburner, which are the big cans you see there, right behind the engine, and that's it. There is no other flow path for that engine. It's as compact as possible.
Let's wander over there so we get away from the compressor a bit, as they are doing things here today at Wings Over the Rockies. We'll work our way around here, not bump into anything. There's the B-18, which is strange, and we'll have to cover that as well. Of course, Pima did a video on that with somebody else, so not jealous at all. Hello, Sophie, hope you're well.
So by shrinking that, you're optimizing a more efficient propulsion installation on the aircraft. It's also good for area ruling, because we talked about that last time. You don't have all of that cross-sectional area for the entire length. You kind of pick it up where you want it, and then it goes away, and you can kind of get more tapered at the front and the back of the airplane. But the downside is, behind that, you've got to do something with the tail, because the tail still needs to stick back there, and that's the kind of the compromise. Everything on aircraft's compromise, and that's the way they chose it. We're going to talk about the F4 in a moment. It actually has almost an identical layout, and they went a very different approach on the tail, which we can talk about.
If we just dive over to the inlets, because for me as a layman, and if you've watched the show before, you will know a Hawker enthusiast, the shape is similar, just bigger than it is on the Hunter. So again, we've got our custom kit, the smooth airflow going down the inside.
A splitter here.
Yep. See our previous video where we go into that into some depth.
Yes.
But this sort of shape as well, this is just going for pure power, getting the airflow up as much as it can into this. So because we talked about shape on, say, the F-100 before, and on this one. And I just wanted to grab on this because it's Hunter-esque, but it's American, so it's much bigger.
Right. Yeah, and keep in mind, this is one of two inlets. Mm-hmm. So twin engine, if you could get inside here, I don't know if the light will show it, but the engine's still in there. So the pitot inlet, so all the air is coming into here, is turning, right? Because the engines are sitting right next to each other on essentially mirrored off aircraft center line. This is outside the fuselage. Remember, there's missiles and a bomb bay inside of here. So we got to turn this air. Pretty basic. There's no moving parts here. It's just bringing that air in at supersonic speed. It's going to slow down as it comes through this opening right here. There's going to be a shock wave inside here. It'll be subsonic behind that. And then the one feature here, so this is a big turning vane, because the airflow has to turn.
Coming in behind you there, right?
Yeah. It doesn't like to turn sharp corners. So basically just putting a vane in here just kind of forces some of the airflow that's out here and nice and happy to actually get around that corner. And you get a little bit of loss from that. It's not a perfect solution, but it's better than it's separating right as it tries to go across that corner, and then half of your engine getting really dirty, turbulent air. So this does get that achieved in a pretty simple device.
So it's very much of its time, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
We'll be talking about another airplane that does lots of interesting things with its inlet later.
Yeah.
But for this case, it's minimizing loss, getting as much high-speed flow.
And the inlet itself is much like the F-100, almost identical. Obviously different shape. It's got the turning where the F-100 doesn't. Of course, it's only feeding one engine. This one is feeding one engine on each side. But the theory of how this inlet works is virtually identical.
Okay. So The wing, I think we should just get, as we're now under the ropes and a lot closer, it is very thin, isn't it?
It's a thin wing.
For an aircraft as big as this.
Yep, and it's a swept, I forget what degree sweep this has. It's not quite as much as the F-100, and so therefore it's a little bit sharper as well. Basically on a supersonic airplane, if you have less wing sweep, you want a little bit sharper of a wing. We talked about the conical camber. You can see that here, this underside concavity that you're getting. Not super pronounced. Again, this was in that early stage where there was a time where this kept getting bigger and bigger as airplanes developed, and then at some point they figured out that was too much, so then they started cranking it back, and this was kind of an early stage version of that. And then of course the wing fence to help keep that span-wise flow from building up and causing more outboard separation and stall problems.
So, I know we keep mentioning that we were mean on this, but actually let's not show this out, but let me come around the other way, otherwise we'll probably get in trouble again. This aircraft had a very long service.
It did.
And yeah, as a Canadian, I know this as a CF-101.
Exactly.
So it's been around, it's done its thing. So dear viewer, it was a gag, but you're getting this all back, because this thing is in service well into the 80s, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know the full details on it, but I believe the recce version was flying still in the 80s. Probably the fighter bomber as well, and it's probably with guard units as well. A lot of older Air Force jets go to cities like Denver as guard units, where the threat of actually encountering an enemy fighter is low, but they still need air defense to ward off bad guys or whatever. So yeah, I believe this airplane finally got retired in the 80s, which was a long run for a Century series.
Yes, and the things that are interesting about it is, as we're here, we might as well get underneath it and have a look, see if we can get into the underside of it, because this is one of the joys of doing shows like this, is we can start looking up into the accesses and things like that. I'm down on one knee, and also, dear listener, I'm not used to being this high up. It's only 5,000 feet, but when you're in Sussex, it's you are not used to altitude. But so we got a couple dummy Falcons, aren't they?
Falcons.
Yep.
So there's an interesting story here, if I understand it correctly. So I don't know my old missiles very well. There was a radar guided and a heat seeker that this aircraft would carry in its internal bay. I don't know which one this is. I'm sorry, I'm not a missile guy. But apparently when they would put the radar or the infrared seeker here, and so when this thing is deployed, it's right behind this little shield. You can see these vents here. The reason these are here is right here. Originally there was guns on this airplane, remember? So there was a gun bay here and guns came out, I don't know where, somewhere here. This is the exit flow for the avionics cooling air. So you can see where this is going. It's blowing hot air out right here straight onto the head of a heat-seeking missile. And so I don't think there was issues where this thing would lock onto itself, but I think that would preheat this nose cone, and then the performance of the missile didn't work right. So they put these diverters here to get that hot air away from the tip of the missile and to get it mixed with cold air such they didn't have that problem. But kind of little fun facts like that you find when you find an aircraft that's been repurposed over its life.
Yeah, it's you modify it, up we get, and you go, didn't think about that. But there we go. So we were a little bit mean, I think.
Absolutely.
It was cut for time, dear listener. That's the whole reason we had a lot of aircraft to cover. But one of the things that is fascinating about this is McDonnell took the lessons learned from this and created arguably the most resilient, modifiable, I would hasten to say, best jet fighter of its age in the F4. And we happen to have one here. So it would be rude not to see what the lessons of the F-101 were that went straight into what was supposed to be the F-110.
Right. Before
Mr. McNamara decided to simplify things. So let's walk over and have a look at the F4.
Yeah.
I just want to
say many thanks to our fabulous Damcasters on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the crew and get your name in the credits from just £3 a month plus a bit of that. The Damcasters is hosted and produced by Matt Bone and is a Boney Abroad podcast production.